This conference will now be recorded.
Hello, everybody. This is a training webinar meant to demonstrate how to do online lessons for students using GoToMeeting. So I'm going to be doing a few different things while we're doing this. I'm going to be giving a short lesson, but while I'm doing that, I'm occasionally going to be stopping and explaining what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. So with that being said, there are a couple of things that are probably some good things to have around before you get started, um, especially for something like math, where it's a little bit hard to totally explain it all just by talking. It's good to have something like a whiteboard that you can write on, and when you have the whiteboard, you can just write whatever you want on it, and people can read it. Preferably a dark marker and a newer one that's not gonna, whatever. The other thing is that you want to make sure you have a way to wipe that off, either a tissue or we have these little, sorry about that, we have these little erasers that you can use. Many of you probably are saying, Chris, I don't have a whiteboard at home. What am I supposed to do? There's a couple different things you can do. In a pinch, what works really well is a clipboard with some scrap paper on it. And with this, you can just take a regular old Sharpie and do the exact same thing. And it's fairly legible. If you have a thicker marker, that is much more readable on the piece of paper. So I would recommend using a thicker marker if you have it, a thicker, darker marker if you have it. So again, either a clipboard with some scrap paper on it, or what I'm going to be using, which is the whiteboard as we go through the lesson. It's just a good way to both reinforce what you're talking about, and it also just makes it look a little bit more interesting. Certainly, probably you don't just want to look at my face this whole time with nothing else to take up the screen. And again, this can help draw students' attention and their focus. So with that in mind, let's do a short lesson just to demonstrate how this all works. And again, I'll be stopping at a couple points to point out some key pointers. One thing before we get the lesson started, and this is something that you should do before every lesson, is ask all participants to mute their microphones. Students might be logging on and they might have their microphones or their phones on. It should just be a large button in the bottom of the screen here that they can hit, and that should mute the sound from their microphone. Also, there is the ability, if you are the presenter, to have it mirror what is on your screen. So if you're going to do a lesson and you want to have a PowerPoint, you can also do something like that. So that's a second option. If you want to have visuals, you can have a PowerPoint as well. Then you're going to want to use the screen sharing option, which should just be a button in your settings. If you're doing this on a laptop, when you move your mouse, it should show up. On mine, it is showing up right here at the bottom of the screen. So with that being said, tell everybody just to please mute their microphones. And if anybody interrupts, sometimes people might call in a little bit late and the sound might interrupt what you're doing. Try not to be too phased about it, so pause, say, oh, hello, so-and-so has just joined us. If you could just please put your phone on silent, that would be great, and we're going to continue. You might also be wondering how people are supposed to comment on this. There is a chat option, so people using either their computers or their cell phones can just type in their questions. A Seeds of Literacy staff member should be available for every single scheduled session that we're doing, and they should be the ones that are really monitoring those questions. You as the tutor / teacher should really just focus on teaching the lesson that you have, and then the staff member can pop in with any questions or concerns as they come along. If at some point you pause and ask for questions, then hopefully the staff member who's doing it has been keeping track of good questions that people have been asking during the course of the presentation. So I would at the very top of the presentation just say, if you have questions, please enter them in the chat, and we will address those when we get to the end of the presentation or halfway through the presentation whatever your style is. If you want to stop every 10 minutes or 15 minutes, that's fine too. Now, today we're going to do just a very short lesson talking about the Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights is a really important document that you've probably heard of. It actually, even though it was written back in the 1780s, it still has a lot of application in everyday life. It literally affects you every single day if you live in the United States. So let's get into it. So again, this is me jumping back out of my lesson. I always start every lesson with just a very general overview. This is the topic we're talking about. Is there some nugget that says why it's so important, or what's my buy-in? Why do I care about this? Try to give something like that right at the beginning, and that's a good way to just get the ball rolling. What you're going to see me do then is slip into a little bit more detail. Before I actually talk about the Bill of Rights itself, I'm going to talk about some context. So let's get into that. So the Bill of Rights affects you every single day if you live in the United States. Now, what's important to know about the Bill of Rights is that this is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. If you have not heard of what amendments are ways to change the Constitution. When the Constitution was written, the Americans had just defeated the British in the American Revolution a few years before, and the first setup of government that they had, the Articles of the Confederation, hadn't really worked out that well. So they decided they were going to draft a new document starting from scratch, and that's what became the Constitution that we still use to this day. However, they knew from the beginning that it wasn't perfect. They never intended it to be perfect. They knew it was going to need to be updated. It was going to need to change. So they built into the Constitution itself something called the amendment process so that you could update or change the document as you went forward. The first 10 amendments are called the Bill of Rights because when they were deciding what to put in the Constitution, the Founding Fathers basically had an argument about should we include rights, what rights are guaranteed to people, or should those be left out? Some people looked at the Constitution and said there's a lot of stuff in here about what the branches do, but there's nothing about what rights are guaranteed for the people. And what did we do all this for if we're not guaranteeing people's rights? So the compromise that they got was that the Constitution itself would focus on just setting up the structure of government mostly. And that the first 10 amendments, well, the first amendments, they didn't know how many there were going to be at first. The first amendments would be guaranteed rights for the citizens. Now, the people that were hesitant about putting rights in the Constitution didn't want to do that because they didn't want that to be a limit to people's rights. They wanted to make sure that this was not an exhaustive list. This was not all of the rights, they said. These are just the ones we're guaranteeing right now. We want to be able to add more. We want other rights to be protected also. So part of the compromise was that one of those amendments would mention the fact that this list of rights was not all of them, that other rights were given to people beyond this list. So the first group of amendments, they debated, they argued, and they came up with 10 of them, and that is what it became the Bill of Rights that we know today. So as we talk about the Bill of Rights, we are going to talk about the very first amendment, the First Amendment. And the First Amendment actually covers 5 different things. So people who are listening and tutors and teachers, I'm going to stop right here and just say again, that exposition that I gave, I didn't really use a lot of visuals because there wasn't a way that I could think of to bring this in right away. But I'm jumping in to bring it in right now because I'm going to be going over a list of different items. And as I'm going into more detail, I'm going to use this more what I hope will be more effectively. Again, I'm giving context. I started off giving all that context so that students would have a good sense of where this is. Depending on what subject you're talking about, that might matter more or less. With math, you might want to talk a little bit about what are some of the math principles that are related to this or that are key to getting started. If you're talking about language arts, you might talk a little bit about, if you talk about pronouns, how these connect to nouns or something like that. but again, some sort of information to lead in, hopefully connecting to something that students might already be familiar with. So back to the Bill of Rights. So the First Amendment guarantees 5 basic things. That's a lot for one amendment, but the founding fathers thought that this was the biggie. This was the big thing they were really concerned about. So the First Amendment covers 5 things, as I said, and we're going to talk about each and every one of them in turn here and why they're in here. There is, by the way, teachers and tutors, going to be a couple pauses like this where you have to write something down. If you can add in, or if you can have some sort of anecdote to talk about while you're doing that, that's great. But probably people will be patient with you if you are not doing it too much. So these first 5 aspects of the First Amendment are in there because they all directly relate back to things that the British had done in the lead up to the American Revolution. So what you're going to see is we're going to be talking a lot about what kind of made the colonists so angry that they started the revolution in the first place. And that's really where the First Amendment ties in, is addressing all those things that made them so upset that the revolution even happened. So it guarantees 5 different things: speech, religion, press, assembly, and petition. Freedom of speech is very important here because one of the things that the British government did not guarantee was your freedom to say whatever you wanted. You could get in trouble. You could be thrown in jail for saying not nice things about the king or the king's government. So the founding fathers thought that was rubbish. They said we should be able to say whatever nasty thing about our leaders as we want. So the very first thing that they put in here was freedom of speech so that people could be critical of their government. This also was because the British did try to curtail what people said and what people talked about in the lead up to the revolution. The second thing is freedom of religion. So with freedom of religion, the reason why a lot of people came to the United States in the first 150 years that it existed, was because over in Europe, pretty much every country had an official religion. In fact, in the 1500s, the official religion of some of those countries began to change, and people that refused to change often paid very heavy penalties. England specifically, where most of the colonists that became Americans came from, England specifically had become Catholic once, became Protestant, switched back to being Catholic, and then went back to being Protestant again. And during some of those switches back and forth, punishments for being the wrong religion were incredibly severe, to the point where many people lost their land, their homes. Some people were even executed, burned at the stake, hanged, and beheaded because they believed the wrong religion. The founding fathers looked at that and said, that's pretty terrible. We never want that to happen in the United States. So they very specifically and very clearly said, this is going to be a government that does not have an official religion, that is not specifically telling people that they have to pray one way or another or at all. It is going to be up to the people to decide what things they want to do. If they want to pray to whoever, that's their choice. The government is staying out of it. The next thing is the freedom of press. Another thing that the British government had done was seized printing presses from newspapers and pamphlet makers who were too critical of the government or too critical of what the British were doing. So the founding fathers looked at that and said, one of the best ways to guarantee a free society is to have information that can be spread or disseminated very easily. So the press is the best way to do that. And we want, again, to make sure people can do that. This really ties in pretty directly with that freedom of speech. The Fourth Amendment is the freedom of assembly. The British government had said you can have not very large groups of people together at one time. That was a way to try and stop there, not only from being riots, which had happened in Boston, for example, but also because they realized that if a large group of people are getting together and getting really angry, that they had the ability to do something. And if you keep that to a small group of people, 2 or 3 people can't really do very much. So the British government had tried to limit crowd sizes or group sizes. And the Americans said, no, that's not really something we like. So there is a freedom to peaceably assemble written into the Constitution. And then finally, the freedom to petition. Basically, this is a way for you to have a say in government about things that you don't like. You can, as the founders would have said, redress your grievances. That is, if the government is trying to do something that you don't like, you can get a petition, you can get other citizens to sign it, and if enough people are on board, it will be put to a vote, and the people will have a direct say over whether or not that is something that will be allowed or not. This still happens. In Cuyahoga County a few years ago, there was a big argument about how some of the funding was going to go to renovate some of the stadiums, like the Gund Arena or Rocket Fieldhouse or the Q, whatever you call it. And people were saying, well, who's going to pay for this? And a lot of the money was going to come from the public. And so a lot of people who really didn't like that plan got together, signed a petition, and forced a vote on it in the upcoming election. So that's what's really nice is that, again, if we don't like something, we can get together and say to our government, we really don't like this, and force the government to have to put it to a vote where the people have the voice, not city council, not the mayor, not anybody else, us, we the people, which is, again, a continuing theme. So let's go on. That's the First Amendment. Before we go on, does anybody have any questions? This is where tutors and teachers, again, I'm moving from one big topic to a second one. And while I'm doing that, that's a really great place to prompt people to ask questions if they have any. If my co-presenter has heard any questions from the people listening in, this is a good chance for them to tell me what those questions are so that I can address them. You can also look over at the chat window, which should be on the side of your screen, to see, again, what sort of questions are they. So in my example here, I have one person asking which amendment states that we can add on more amendments, right? So again, they're asking me a good question, and this is my chance to answer it. When you ask for questions, though, a lot of people, especially if you haven't been in front of a classroom before, will say, oh, does anybody have any questions? They'll pause for 1 or 2 seconds, and then they'll move on. Any questions? Great, let's go on. And the truth is that most people need a little bit more what's called processing time to work that out. So you want to give people at least 15 or 20 seconds to really think about it. And you might want to even give them a little bit more than that if you really want questions, because people have to type these in, and not everybody is the fastest typer. So again, 20 seconds I would say is a pretty good rule of thumb. The current health emergency, the CDC has been recommending people wash their hands for 20 seconds anyway. So whatever technique or song you've been singing to yourself to time that 20 seconds, I would do the exact same thing when you ask a question or ask people for comments. Again, just giving everybody that time to process that you asked for a question, think about what they've heard, and turn that into a useful response. Okay, so now I'm going to answer the question since I solicited them. I see that Potato One asked what amendment states that we can add on more amendments. That's a great question. It's actually not an amendment itself. It is in one of the articles of the Constitution. So if you go back to the Constitution, it is one of those articles. I honestly don't remember which one it is right now, but that's something I can look up for you and get you by the end of the session. Great. Also, don't promise that you're going to get somebody information like that unless you actually intend to do so. That's very frustrating. So I'll get back to you about that by the end of the session. Let's move on now, since that's the only question. Let's move on to the Second Amendment. And if I was going to keep using my whiteboard, I would add it and I would talk about the stuff there. I'm just, for demonstration purposes, I'm going to switch over to my my alternative that I mentioned, and that is using the clipboard with a piece of paper on it. I'm gonna take that map off. Again, using a Sharpie is probably okay. I'm going to recommend that you don't use something like a pen or a pencil when doing this, and let me show you why. If I start talking about the Second Amendment, and I'm going to say, it's about guns, and this is how I write it, this is very, very hard to read because I just used a pen, right? If I use a Sharpie marker, this is dark brown, I get dark red, dark brown, or black are probably the best colors. That shows up a lot better, even though it's not a whole lot thicker than the other one. Your best option, though, honestly, is a thicker marker like this. That is very, very legible. So we're going to talk now about the Second Amendment. And what's the Second Amendment about, everybody? It's about guns. Now, tutors and teachers, stepping back from the lesson for a moment, this is a historical topic that there is some controversy around. I generally don't recommend ignoring that. Instead, what I try to do is address it in a very straightforward but even-handed manner. I want to give the students the facts and let them make the decisions by themselves. My goal is that you cannot tell what my opinion is one way or the other based on watching this video. Instead, I want students to hear a reasonable explanation of what this is. If I'm going to talk about it being controversial, I want to just explain that in a very even-handed way, why there's differing points of view, and give the students enough information to make up their own mind. So let's do that right now. We're going to talk about the Second Amendment. And what's the Second Amendment about? Guns. Hey. So with the Second Amendment, what it literally says is that, sorry, it takes me a minute to remember the exact wording. The existence of a militia being necessary for a well-regulated militia being necessary for the existence of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That's what it says. This is an amendment that has had a little bit of controversy because some people say that it's particularly talking about having a well-regulated militia, which is something that we really don't have that much of anymore. Other people think it's much more about the individual right to have a gun for yourself. More modern court cases have generally supported the second point of view. So if you look at more modern court cases, they generally have talked about people's rights to own guns being the core of what that amendment is. But again, you will still find people that disagree about that on one side or the other. So why is this such a big deal? Why did they put this in here? Because when the founding fathers were putting together the Constitution, what they wanted to do was, again, make a government that addressed a lot of the things they didn't like about the governments that they'd come from. And the very first thing that got the American Revolution started was the battle at Lexington and Concord. What happened was the British government decided that having a large stockpile of guns that the citizens could get a hold of was maybe not a good thing. So they sent a group of British soldiers to confiscate the guns that the local people in Lexington and Concord used for their own, actually specifically in Concord, used for their own defense. These weapons were used not just to defend against the British, they weren't used at all against the British before this. They had been used against Native Americans, against the French, who had contested territory nearby in a war only a decade before. They used it for hunting, and they used it for defense against just general outlaws and group of like bandits. They were basically the 1700s equivalent of gangs. So though that communal stockpile of guns was used for a variety of purposes, the British government decided to seize those weapons. The colonials heard about it before it happened, and they began to take the guns out of the arsenal. And to have enough time to do that, a group of local people called the Minutemen That was a local militia that, again, was organized to help defend the neighborhood, defend the community. A group of these people called the Minutemen met in Lexington, nearby Concord, to basically stall the British advance. They basically did not want to actually start a fight. They just wanted to make it so the British wouldn't get to Concord before all the guns and gunpowder and bullets had been moved. However, it didn't work out the way anybody intended. The British showed up, the Minutemen were waiting, and somebody started shooting. Nobody actually knows who fired the first shot, but that fight, the Battle of Lexington and Concord, is the first battle of the American Revolution. So the whole fight started over a government trying to seize people's means of protecting themselves. So, regardless of exactly how the Second Amendment is interpreted, it is definitely about a people's right for their own protection. And again, some people will talk about this being more about militias. Some people talk about this being more about personal defense. If you see this on the test, my guess is that a lot of times it'll be talking about that controversy, actually. So just expect to see that and expect that you might see a couple different points of view. All right, so that is my end of the Second Amendment part, and that's where I'm going to really wrap up the lesson in the detailed portion. I could go through the rest of the amendments the exact same way, but I think you kind of get the gist of what we're doing here. So again, I'm trying to directly address questions. I'm trying to give people detailed information as well as a little bit of context. As I wrap up, though, the one last thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to ask people to listen for just one last bit, and that is I want to give them a summary or a conclusion. Sometimes it's good to think about teaching a lesson like a sandwich, where the top bread is you introducing, hey, this is what I'm going to tell you about. That's an introduction I gave with context earlier. The meat of the sandwich, that is the details, the context. That was me pulling out my whiteboards here. Hey, let's talk about the stuff. And answering questions pretty directly. And then at the very end, the bottom slice of bread is me basically summarizing what I was talking about. So a brief summary saying something to the effect of, all right, so those are the first 10 amendments. As we talked about, they're all pretty important. Some of them have a lot more relevance today than they did back then, and some of them don't have a lot of relevance anymore because times have changed so much. But again, these were the rights that the founding fathers thought were most important to protect for Americans in the new country that they were founding. Thank you very much. If anybody has any final questions, I'll stick around for just a minute or two here to answer any questions. Again, now I'm asking for more questions, which means I have to be willing to be patient for another 20 or 30 seconds. That can be very awkward to sit there in silence. So again, if you have like a small detail or tidbit to offer while that's going on, that's okay. But really, honestly, you should just try to get comfortable being silent for 15 or 20 seconds. And that was 20 seconds. So again, thank you very much for watching this test webinar presentation about how we hope to run some of these lessons. This is just a good template to follow. Again, if you have other ideas or other experience that you can bring in, that's fantastic. This is really just a way to give everybody a basis on which to build on. So let your own style and your own energy carry through. The more positive you come off, the more energetic you come off, the more interesting this is going to be. If you just talk in a bland monotone and don't really do much more than this, the webinar lesson will not be very exciting. Whereas if you try to engage people, try to give a little bit more life to your voice, again, try to include some visual aids if you can, that spices up things a whole heck of a lot. If you have more information, or sorry, more questions or want more information, please reach out to us as quickly as possible so that we can answer those. And again, I want to thank you all very, very much for A, watching this, and B, being willing to keep helping our students through this difficult and challenging time. We greatly, greatly appreciate your help. Thank you very much and have a great day.
This conference will now be recorded.